Welcome back, everyone, to the Share Your Why podcast. So excited to be here with you today. I've got an incredible guest. I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have, and I know I'm going to get a lot out of it. I'm sure you will too. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. Today, I have with me Parker Mays. He's a junior at NC State studying marketing. He's also a global communications intern at a company called LexisNexis in Raleigh, and the host of Taking a Breath podcast. This is a podcast that I myself have absolutely loved tuning into. I've gotten to talk to Parker in the process of him creating it over the course of the last probably 4 or 5 months or so, and it's been incredible to see the progress he's made. So I'm really excited to talk about that today. Taking a Breath podcast is a platform created to share stories of leaders from different backgrounds with young listeners. He's also been involved for the past 2 years with the Impact Leadership Village at NC State, which was an organization I was also a part of, and really places an emphasis on the importance of being engaged in the community around himself. Today, Parker and I are going to be talking all about how to get started. Let's say you have a great idea, you have something you really want to do, but you're just not sure where to start. I've definitely been there many times before. I was there myself, even with creating this podcast and this whole initiative. And the best person I know to help me to address that problem in my own life is Parker. Parker is absolutely fantastic. Like, we had a conversation earlier this year and he was like, oh yeah, I think I'm gonna start this podcast thing. I got this idea. I was like, oh yeah, sounds good. I'm kind of doing something similar. That's cool. Let's compare notes. And then I talked to him again the next week and he already had 2 episodes out. And I was like, whoa, Parker, hold on. What are you doing? So I'm here today to just be a listener and a learner and find out how Parker does that, how he gets to that point of just firing things off and just doing, rather than a problem that I definitely have in my life, which is just thinking about things a lot, right? But yeah, I'm excited to just kind of have a conversation back and forth today. So let's kick it off. Parker, could you just share kind of your story and a little bit more of your background?
100%. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to share today. So I'm Parker, and I've always grew up in the Raleigh area, and parents as well. So it's always interesting to really see development over years and generations. But then my mom graduated from NC State a few decades ago. I always had kind of that interest and the legacy from there. But as I was getting into high school, I realized wow, NC State could really bring a lot of value. Both of my parents are in business. And so that's why I started to see the interest in business. And then, as I'm going through high school and thinking about graduating, started meeting people and mentors that were here, got connected with some really great alumni. And so really that was where I started to realize NC State could really be the place. Obviously, since being here, have gotten so much value from it, exactly as much as I thought I would have. Really, over the past few years, I've spent a lot of time thinking about who I am and really what my purpose is. Meeting Thomas a few years ago was one of the coolest things that happened to me right when I started here at NC State. Got plugged in with Impact Leadership Village, which is where we met. And that really started me on a journey of discovering who I was as a leader and how to help build up leaders around me. And so you mentioned the Taking a Breath podcast. That's something I started just a few months ago as a way to continue to not only learn from the mentors in my life, but also to then provide content that's going to help build other leaders as well. So that's really kind of been my start to my story, and where I really felt like I was able to kind of own the growth that I wanted to see in myself and really take action to grow in kind of the same way that you're looking at right now with this podcast and the different ideas associated with it, which is really exciting.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And then specifically, I think you and I probably talked for the first time maybe 6 months ago or something about this idea that you had for starting a podcast. Tell us a little bit more about that and kind of what led you to the idea and then what led you to take action.
So it was something that really one day I was thinking through, how can I basically set up some accountability for me to constantly create a platform for growth, specifically for myself. And that was kind of how the podcast started. Was I was really interested in on a weekly basis, meeting with someone who I could get a lot of value from, who I could learn from about a variety of different leadership, mentoring, and growth topics. So that's kind of how I started. It was really for me, it was kind of selfishly, I want to learn. And the podcast side of it was, I knew that if I had people that I knew would be, interested in checking it out and tuning in, I knew I would want to continue. And so I'm just over 3 months in now, and it definitely has provided that, right? Getting to meet tons of new people from different backgrounds, getting to learn lots of lessons, and then being able to share with an audience of, like you mentioned, specifically younger leaders interested in growth.
Absolutely fantastic. I can tell, Parker, you've been through a lot more podcasts than I have, so you know how to make the conversation flow. I'm all about it. One of the things I've been most impressed about in your story just in the last couple of months has been your ability to not only yourself dedicate to having this, platform for accountability, like you call it. I love that. But also finding other people who are willing to join on and come help you and volunteer to be a part of the mission you're trying to achieve. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how did you find those people and how did you get them to be on your side?
For a little bit of context for people who don't know, basically over the course of the few months that I've been working on the podcast, I have a few people who work with me helping with video editing, audio editing, and content creation for the podcast. As I was starting, first 6 weeks or so, I'm doing it by myself, doing all the editing and all this stuff. And I realized as one person, like trying to build this platform is really challenging. So as I'm thinking through that, I'm like, I know that I've always struggled. And, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this with this idea of like, I can't do it all on my own. And so that was one of the first things that I'm like, if I want to be a leader and I want to learn about team building, but I'm not able to actually do it myself, then that value, there's a disconnect there. So I started reaching out to people literally just through Instagram. I said, hey, I'm looking for someone to do audio editing, video, mention the things that I just talked about. And I had people reach out to me that were like, hey, I would love to do this for you. I have interest in this and that type of thing. And really in kind of what I call like quote unquote interviews, obviously not like a formal interview or anything, but literally just a call to learn more about them. I asked them not how are you going to provide value to me, but how can I provide value to you? And some people were really like taken aback by that. Like, what do you mean? Like you mean that you're trying to get value from me? I'm like, no, like I want to make sure that there's value two-way, because otherwise you're going to be here for 2 weeks and then be gone. So that was a big part of the process. But for me, it was really like, I want to find the right people to connect with. And so for me, but building that team was a really important part of it. That's now helping me to kind of grow it to the next level.
Thank you so much for sharing. I find a lot of similarities there in what I've been doing too. It's when you meet somebody new who's going to help you as you're trying to get started with something, instead of just immediately being like in the mindset of you're going to receive from them. Instead, it's that giving mindset where it's like, hey, let me see what I can do to help this person first. And, maybe it'll lead to something down the line, but who knows, we're not attached to that. It's all about, can I give value to this other person? I love that.
That's right. And I think that value is something that no matter where you're at in life, you can give it. I think a lot of people, especially starting out, they don't really realize that their perspective is so unique, or that some talent they have is so unique. And it's just something that it's a mindset shift of like, oh, wow, like my story really is unique. I can bring interesting things. Like the youngest member of my team is just turned 17. Initially, she was like, oh, is there like much value I can bring? And I was like, your perspective is completely different than mine. There's all this different perspectives. That's also the target audience that I'm working with, right? So I think that's super unique, and even for young people to think about.
That's awesome. Well, the part that I get excited about and kind of the reason for the whole podcast is figuring out what motivates people, what gets you out of bed in the morning. So I'm curious to hear that for you personally, and then also just how has your why impacted your story, especially as you're trying to build this community?
The first answer is really, to me, what gets me excited, what inspires me, my why is like seeing growth in other people. At the end of the day, like just across the board, right? So whether it's leadership, whether it's business, in any aspect, if I can see someone is passionate about something, is passionate about growth, and I can help to cultivate that, I can help them to take action. Like, to me, that's where I really get excited. That's what motivates me to get up. And then from there, in terms of my story, right, this platform for leadership has really helped me, because when I'm thinking about leadership, I'm not thinking about it specifically in terms of, oh, like business leadership or, I'm from a faith background of like church leadership, things like that. It's not specifically that. It's like, no matter what your belief system is, no matter what your background is, if you apply these leadership ideas, take action, own your growth, those type of ideas, you're going to see the success and the growth in yourself that you want to see. So that's kind of inspired some of the steps that I've taken on my story. I realized like, okay, it isn't just personal growth that inspires me. Like, I love to grow, but from there, it's like, I love to see other people grow. I love to get connected with people that are interested in really growing themselves as well.
It's always great to hear what people are motivated by. And I can tell that, just to give you a compliment, like everything that you do is so clearly motivated by that desire to better other people, not just to better yourself. So I've always really appreciated that about you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure, man. So tell me this, what have been some of the more difficult parts? What are some of those things that you're still working on and still working through?
There's two things. One, we touched on not being able to do it all myself. That's been something I think for a lot of leaders getting started and realizing that process of maturity, especially for people who are a little bit more perfectionist. It's like, I want to have my hands in everything. I want to know all the details. And at some point, in order to really see a platform grow to the next level, you have to be willing to trust and delegate, right? Like empowering other people to, bring them on. And that's what I really did with the team is like, all right, if you're interested in personally growing and you're willing to really get on board, I want you like all in, like, come on, like bring it on board. We're going to all see this growth together. And then the other thing, like you mentioned beforehand, it's a balance. Really, for me, as someone who I really want to be involved in a lot of things, I think there's so many opportunities for seeing growth in other people, right? Like you can basically, if you're the type of person who wants to see other people grow, anywhere you get connected, you can see that. And so for me, it's really about balancing getting connected and investing my time in the right things. And that's been something with school, with the internship, with the podcast. It gets to be a lot. I think for a lot of people who are really interested in growth, it's something that's balancing. So that's something that I've found difficult, but it's a challenge I'm really working on overcoming, especially this school year. I think I'm going to see a lot of growth there as I'm realizing how to say no to things that aren't really in line with that mission that I really want to achieve.
No is a powerful word. It's a scary word though, especially for people like you and me, who I know we love to just say yes to everything. We love to help everybody all the time and right now. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're pouring into ourselves first so that we can pour into others. I've definitely struggled with a lot of the same things you were just saying, and I really appreciate you sharing. But one thing that's definitely helped me recently is just constantly reorienting to that purpose or the why. It's like, hey, when things get hard, your purpose should be set such that like when you look back at it, you're like, wow, but I'm still impacting other people, or I'm still seeing that I'm taking steps towards that, or I see that I am helping other people to grow professionally or personally. And I hope that you're able to see the impact that you are having and hopefully use some of that to motivate you, even sometimes when things feel a little bit overwhelming.
I agree. I think there's a lot of value to not only like motivating people to get to their first steps or their next level, but really following through with it. I think there's a lot of people who want to get really hype and get people into something, but then don't really follow that person. For me, a lot of it is like, if I can find one person and go on the journey with them, that's where I see a lot of that excitement versus like, yo, you should really, really take this first step. And then they take the first step and I'm gone. And then I come back 2 months later and they never really got started.
I'm curious if you found any ways to stay in touch with people or to continue to engage with them even after the beginning, because that's definitely something I want to try and do. To share your why and everything here is just trying to stick with people through the entire process, not just, like you said, getting them started, but also helping them to figure out each step along the way.
100%. And it's hard as the platform grows. I'll be 100% honest with you. I have podcasts that I've worked with back like in May. I actually just DM'd one the other day. I was like, hey bro, I noticed you haven't posted in a couple weeks. Like, what's been up? And he was like, yeah, like I got really busy. I realized like it wasn't really my thing. And it's those types of things where I realized like, oh dang, like I wonder if I was really like in close touch with him, like would he have stopped podcasting? But then there's other situations, right, where I catch it, right? I'm like, hey, I saw that you mentioned you're taking a break. Like, what's the reason? And there have been specific examples where people have been like, dang, you're right. Like my goals are still helping people, right? Like, so for me, it's hard as the platform grows because you lose sight of people, but it's about having those core people that not only are really receptive to learning, but they're like really interested in like a two-way learning process, right? Like they're interested not only in learning from you and hearing from you, but they're also interested in reaching out to you and being like, hey, I'm struggling with this specifically. So that's kind of been my thing is like, are they receptive to almost like a two-way communication? Because it can't just always be one way.
It's one thing I've definitely struggled with as well, is just finding ways to get people to engage in, like you said, the two-way conversation and asking questions back and forth. I think a lot of times when people think about mentors or they think about, people who are kind of up on this pedestal that they might want to meet someday, but when they finally do get a chance to meet that person, they're, just like, oh, wow, I'm like so in awe of this person that I'm not going to ask them any questions. But actually the most flattering thing you could do is probably to ask questions. At least in my experience, like asking those types of people questions and continuing the conversation that way is almost flattering to them because it helps them feel like, oh, wow, this person really cares about me and about my opinions.
I'll share a story that's kind of like one of not my best moment from the podcast. I got a chance to share a conversation with someone who, in my opinion, was kind of like really next level. I knew of him, but it was kind of a second connection. And he is like a TED Talk speaker and like a Dale Carnegie coach and had some like really good credentials, but he reached out to me and was just really interested in the podcast and wanted to help. And so I was like, hey, is there any way you'd be willing to have a conversation? And he was so willing to. And then we get to the recording and I absolutely just was like so shocked, like what you're talking about. I felt so not qualified, almost like I was limiting myself when I knew, like, I've done interviews, like I'm doing this every week, every day, like I can do this. And so I think that's the thing a lot of times is we place limits on ourselves where we don't feel good enough to like really pursue that next level. So I think that's a big limiting factor.
Have you found any tips or tricks or mental things you can do to try and power past that?
Confidence. That's it. It's repetition too. For me, that was the first time that I had realized, wow, I felt inadequate. As soon as I finished that interview, I went and sat down and just started thinking about next time, like, how can I avoid this? And to me, it was really like, even if you feel that way, if you're willing to overcome the kind of uncomfortability of like just getting started now, right? I'm doing them with people I don't know or have never met before. I'm talking to people across the world. I just did one with a guy in London. He's 24, business owner, had never met him before. And it's like that. And it's just if you can figure out a way to make quick connections with people and then have the confidence to overcome the uncomfortable, then that's where you're going to see the real success of it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. That's going to be huge advice for me. So Parker, we're both starting these content production initiatives, and I love that we're doing it kind of close to the same time so we can bounce ideas back and forth. It's been really fun just doing, the every other weekend hanging out and doing some accountability sessions kind of thing and just passing ideas back and forth. I absolutely love that. And the thing that I've always been so impressed with you about is literally you just kind of like say something like, hey, I had this idea. I think I should do this thing. Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. And then I talk to you like 2 weeks later and you're like, oh yeah, the first one's already posted. It's ready to go. I'm over here. It takes me an entire year literally to get to this point where I'm comfortable enough and feel like I have everything together and gotten everybody's feedback and have it all together and it's ready to go. And I am definitely way closer to the perfectionist side than you are, but still the content that you put out is fantastic and I really enjoy it. So, and I can tell that you really have an impact on the people who engage with it, myself included. So I'm curious to hear what is kind of your method or your process that you use? Like, hey, if you have a new idea for something you want to do, like what's your next steps?
Just to start this conversation, because I love this question and I do love sharing this. I want to ask you just a real brief question. After a year, right? So you mentioned that like it took quite a while to kind of develop the process. Do you feel like right when you started, was that first episode just like this perfect, like in all its glory, or is there still going to be room to improve?
I think there's definitely still going to be room to improve. It's a iterating process. Like every week, I'm going to hopefully get better at it.
That was kind of a little bit of my perspective too. I realized that I'm going to get started and it's not going to be perfect. I think that I could have spent 5 years. I could have spent 10 years. I could have spent 20 years getting through my career and established and then be like, all right, I'm ready to start this leadership podcast. And it could have been exactly the same episode as I did today, right? I would have lived more. I would have done more. But at the end of the day, I realized that the impact that I can make today as a 20-year-old young leader is going to be different, but it's going to be in some sense the same as the impact that I could have in 20 years on the same listener, right? Or the same type of person. And I think that was for me a mental shift of, okay, I could wait till it's perfect or wait till I have all this experience. But then I felt like really like, why wait? And that's what I was talking about earlier when I talked about the 16-year-old team member of like, yeah, I could wait till she's 30 and has experience video editing and wait till all that. But like, why can't I bring her in now? Why can't we all start somewhere and grow together? And I think because my journey is one of growth specifically, every listener knows I'm not where I want to be. I'm just taking one step today from where I am to where I want to be. And I think if you've got that mindset of it's never going to be the perfect time to start, then I think that's really what drove me to like, all right, let's make today day one.
Dang, Parker, I'm constantly impressed by your ability to have a mindset like that at your age. I'm sure you hear that a lot, but like I've known you for what, 3 years now? And I remember when we first met, you had some of that, but I'm curious, like, where do you think some of that mindset came from? Was it reading books or podcasts or just meeting people or arriving at conclusions yourself? I'm really curious.
I would say a lot of it really is, I'm the type of person who I learn the most from experience. I don't want to discredit anyone in my life because there are a lot of really good leaders and good people in my life who have taught me a lot of things. But for me, I can learn things, but there's a difference between learning something via conversation or a fact or a thought and actually doing it. And so that for me was a big shift of like, yeah, we can talk all day long. Let's talk. Like you can get me hyped up. Like, we can have a phone call. But if then I get off the phone call and I'm going back to my everyday routine, then what did I learn? Right? That's been a big shift.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm curious, like, what is your kind of process for, hey, you have a new idea, something you want to get started with. What is your, I mean, I know the simple version is just do it.
Sure.
But, a little bit more than that, I'm curious.
100%. One of the big tools that I use a lot of my, like, the smaller business ideas or, the podcast or some of these things that I'm working on have centered around this. And it's especially relevant right now. If you're watching later, COVID-19 pandemic, and we're all online, kind of tucked away a little bit, but is social media. I think that because there is such a technological shift, especially over the past few months, that social media or technology is a really good field to be in, is a really good tool to use. And so that's something that I found a lot. A few years ago, I started doing furniture resale, literally just on the side, trying to make some money all through Facebook. Facebook has a tool called Marketplace. I was picking up free furniture off of that app and I was reselling it for $100. And I was literally 100% profit, no overhead. And that was, using the social media tool. I started doing podcast content creation over the summer and picked up clients just by DMing, reaching out for people. I think that if you can find a problem and then find a way that technology or social media outreach, you can use it for your advantage. I think a lot of times that is where I'm seeing a lot of the benefit, because we know that everything could change. We could literally 3 months ago, we got stuck inside and didn't leave for 2 months. But if we can have some insane world shifting change like that happen and our model still would work, or there's still adaptations of it that could work, then that's where you're going to see really like more long-term success. And sure, like, yeah, just get started. But if you can get started with something that you can see as like adaptability, and can really shift to change as the world changes, then that's where I think there's the most potential for growth.
No, I absolutely love that. That's awesome.
Kind of to follow up on that, like, what would be your process? I know our processes have looked a little bit different, but like for you, right, getting started, taking a little bit more of the time on the process, what does that look like for you and how do you see the benefits of it?
So like I said, I mean, it's kind of been a year-long process. It's really been like 6 months of like the actual process of going through it. And I definitely think that I could have done things a lot faster. I probably should have, but at the same time, there are a lot of things from, more of the perfectionist angle that I think will end up being beneficial. For example, when I have an idea of something I want to start, the first question I ask is, hey, how can this idea, or how does this idea line up with my mission and my purpose, right? So that's obviously the first thing, making sure I can constantly be referencing back to that. And honestly, usually I'm trying not to just come up with an idea just to be a solution to something. It's kind of the natural way that ideas pop up in our heads. But I actually try and take, some of the advice from my entrepreneurship classes and figure out what the problem is first that people are facing, and then figure out potential solutions to it and then narrow those down, right? So that's kind of the ideal way to do it. But when I'm actually looking to like start a new initiative or something like that, or start something like Share Your Why, then the first thing I knew I wanted to do was just meet as many people as I possibly could, especially people who had experience with communication or with running podcasts or YouTube channels and stuff like that, or with just living a mission-driven life and sharing that with other people. And the cool thing is, it's not just meeting people, but it's also getting them to take ownership in what you're doing. This has been absolutely huge. So like I set the goal of meeting with 100 people. Meeting with that many people has totally changed my perspective on life in so many different ways. But the biggest thing has been also following up with those people and constantly asking them for advice on what I'm building. So as I'm going through this process, everybody I've met with constantly just like emailing or texting with them back and forth and asking for their advice on like, hey, we're thinking about this logo. Like, what do you think? Or, who do you think would be good to reach out to for this kind of episode we're trying to make? And I think that by doing that, it's become apparent that the people you ask for their advice, again, it kind of goes back to flattering them. It's like literally they're like, oh, wow, this person really cares about my advice here. And they think that I have an important viewpoint for what they're trying to create. So they end up being the biggest cheerleaders, the biggest supporters, constantly bringing people in to introduce or bring in different resources and things like that. So that's been like one of the best things possible, is just taking the time to meet with people, chat with them about what I'm trying to do, why I'm trying to do it, and then also keeping them in tune along the way so that they'll take ownership in what I'm creating, and therefore hopefully want to share it out further and want to stay involved in the future.
I love that. And I think that because we're coming right from two opposite kind of ways to do it, where I like came up with the idea on Wednesday and started it on Monday, and you really put the time and thought into it. I think that you're right in terms of like the people that are invested in the idea is 100% going to be so beneficial, right? And we've talked about that a lot. But I think it's really interesting, and part of the reason why I am loving this conversation is that we came at it from such different angles, but we're both, at the same, point right now where we're like really headed off toward growth. And you and I have had that conversation of like, it'll be really interesting to see how these two different approaches pan out, right? Because I think that yours, because you have those people invested, right, you are seeing a lot of that growth from the start, whereas I really had nobody in my corner from the start, right? I had to kind of pave that way as I went. And so I think that's a really interesting like way to get started, and definitely helps a lot with like as you're kicking it off and we're getting started.
I agree 100%. So, Parker, what is like one piece of advice? Like, what's the biggest piece of advice that you would give to somebody who is trying to start something, but they're just not sure where to start? They're not sure what to do. They've got an idea, but they're not sure what to do next. What's your advice?
I think that there's two things. One is there are so many resources of like what other people are doing that you can be checking out, right? Like, if it's something that has never been done before, right? Like you're a really top innovation, then, that's something where you can be reaching out to people around you. But there's a lot of these people, right? Resources we're finding online. I mean, we see so much of the almost like quote unquote mentors are people who like we don't know personally. It's just content that we're consuming. And I think that's one of my biggest like pieces of advice is like, if you don't have someone that immediately comes to mind as like, oh, like this is someone that I really look up to, even if it's not someone you personally know, that's a great place to get started cultivating some of those like core ideas. But then for me, a lot of it is just like reaching out to the people around me, friends, parents, teachers, like all of these different people you have in your direct circle, I feel like is a great way to get started. If you don't have that, all right, I'm getting started day one type of mentality, that's totally okay, because people aren't all like that. And I totally understand that. And I think that approach of let me check in with people around me and learn from them, or looking at resources, the people that you know of or have heard of, that's a great way to get started looking at that resources. What would your kind of take on that be?
Absolutely love that. I think for me, like if somebody has an idea, the number one thing is just making sure that you start with a problem, right? So it's not just starting with the solution. It's not just assuming that whatever your idea is or your service you want to offer, or product you want to make, or a thing you want to do for people, not just assuming that they're going to, really latch onto it and they're going to want it, because maybe they won't, just because of maybe some anecdotal stuff from some friends or some family. You might assume that people are really interested in what you have to offer, but it might not be the case immediately. You might need to pivot in some way. You might need to adjust it so that it addresses some sort of pain point that they have. And so that's something I learned in my entrepreneurship classes, but I think it applies almost universally in life. It's just, people, there's a lot of problems out there in the world and a lot of things that need to be solved. And it's our job to really start with the problems and figure out solutions from there, not just creating solutions just for the sake of it being a solution.
What are some of the ways that you found when you started this project, right? From like conversation one to like starting, actually day one, what are some of the misconceptions you had, or like how you shifted your mindset as a result of talking to all these people?
Yeah, the number one thing I did to kind of apply that principle was we reached out and did a bunch of quote unquote customer interviews right at the beginning. So I had a general idea of what we wanted to do. We had an idea of why we wanted to do it, but now when it came down to the what and the how, we really wanted to talk to people, talk to people who are kind of in our target audience of, around college age kind of thing, and really ask them like, hey, what are the challenges that you're facing? What are the struggles that you're facing? And we did that. And before we asked them, we also just made a list ourselves of all the struggles that we were facing. And it was really cool to see that when we got that data back, like how many of those things matched up, right? It's like just this realization I'm sure you've had as well, like, wow, there's so many problems that we all have that are shared. They're not, as much as it might seem isolating or it might seem like we're the only ones who have that problem, 90% of the time it's not true. There's probably a lot of other people around you who have that same problem. So my question is, why go through any of it alone?
100%. And I think, for me, even it's like as I'm going, because I didn't do that, literally this morning, I got a text from one of my good friends. He was actually on the podcast a while back, and he texted me. He was like, hey, man, love like all the content you're putting out and everything like that. And he's like, I've got to be honest with you. Like the biggest mistake you're making right now is that you're not putting out content on LinkedIn. And I called him. Like I was like, hey, like we need to call. Like I want to talk more. And he's like, you're creating personal development content and you're putting it out on just where people are just trying to consume like other people's feeds and all this type of stuff. He's like, LinkedIn is where people go to see professional and personal development. And he's talking me through this. So as I'm putting out content, right, and I'm putting it out on Instagram, and he's of course saying like, dude, like, why aren't you putting it out on LinkedIn? And so I'm realizing like I'm missing this huge target audience. And it's just because this one dude, right? And if I had gone through some of these things of like, maybe talking to more people, I would have realized like, oh shoot, you're so right. And so that's something I've really shifted towards. And especially as we're talking, is like, who can I be getting advice from that's not just me or just my team, that's going to be adding perspectives? And that's been something that's been really important as I continue to grow, not only grow personally, not only grow the podcast, but grow the community around the podcast.
Yeah, it's all about figuring out what people want. Where do they want to consume your content? How do they want to consume it? How long should it be? What platform should it be on? Those sorts of things. And the good news is it doesn't need to be like fancy interviews or anything like that. It can literally just be like a Google form you send out. Getting that user-generated feedback, I think, is absolutely awesome. So I'm glad to hear that's a direction you're going to take, and happy to help in any way that I can for sure. I would love to hear just like, what is one action you think that I should take, and that I'm sure some of the people listening as well could probably benefit from, but what is one action you think that I should take after the conversation today?
For you, like, I think it's really interesting to hear more of like what your actual process was, right? Because we've talked about it a little bit, but really to get that clarity of like what that looked like. And after hearing that, I think it's really a balance, because you and I are very different people. But for me, after listening to this conversation, I know that I'm going to start to shift a little bit more towards the center of like, not only do I need to jump right in day one, but I do need to really collect that feedback, because I'm hearing a lot of the advantages. If I have an idea, don't be afraid to get started. Don't be afraid to try it, or at least really like put into action some of those steps that could really lead to the benefit side of it. For me, that's been a big thing, is like not only like the idea overall of the podcast, but specifically like, okay, let's try YouTube. Let's try LinkedIn. He called me this morning. I was like, tomorrow I'm going to put out my first piece of content on LinkedIn. No questions asked. And it's that side of stuff. It's like, no, I didn't need permission. I didn't need perfection. I just needed to do that whole scale. I'm just kind of balancing it a little bit towards the middle.
I appreciate that so much. And it's definitely something I want to try and do. And for me, it's always whenever I see a gap in something that I'm doing, it's finding a system or a process I can use to address that, right? And I think maybe for me, even if it's just like, writing down the ideas that I have one week, and then making sure that like, hey, let's put a deadline on one of these. Let's at least like try something out, even if it's a really small little, minimum viable product, we call it on entrepreneurship classes, an MVP version of that idea. Let's give it a shot now and just see what happens, rather than just, talking about it in circles kind of thing. So no, I really do appreciate that advice. Thank you so much.
100%. And I think there's a lot of value to the process. There's a lot of value to jumping in. And I'm learning, you know what I mean? Like that's my biggest thing. I mentioned it earlier, is learning from experience, but that's one of the things that I know that's how I learn. And so if I'm self-aware that, okay, like I could have conversations with people, but I'm not really going to take it to heart unless I try it, then, it's all about that, like self-reflection and self-awareness. And that's where you're going to see really the most personal growth out of that type of idea.
Parker, this has been such a great experience. Thank you so much. I know you and I get to chat all the time, but when we get really intentional about digging into it, I get so much out of it. So yeah, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
I'm so happy to be here and happy to share, and definitely hope we can continue the conversation.
Of course. Parker, where can people go to get a hold of you if they want to learn more?
Absolutely. So if you are on Instagram, definitely check us out at Taking a Breath Podcast. As of tomorrow, and by the time this episode airs, we'll be posting content on LinkedIn. My name is Parker Mays. You can check me out there, and definitely we'll continue to be posting content, new episodes every Friday on Taking a Breath. So would love for you to check that out as well if you're interested in leadership and personal growth.
Definitely recommend that everybody checks out Parker's content. It's absolutely phenomenal, and I could not recommend anybody more. So definitely do that. But thank you everybody so much for tuning in today for the Share Your Why podcast. Parker, really appreciate being here and looking forward to having another great conversation next week.